Hello and welcome to History 391. This is day 2, back after the spring break, and it's probably time to kind of talk just very briefly about where we are as a class, at least I think it is. I've been struggling a little bit, to be perfectly honest, with the working at home thing, with the needs of my children, and my wife and myself have made things difficult. I really wanted to create these short, bite-sized, 5 to 6 minute videos for you guys to be really interesting and accessible, but you know, recording those things and editing them, not including writing them, which is different from writing a lecture. It's all been dreadfully time consuming and it makes things very, very difficult. I want to make sure I'm as available as possible for you guys over Zoom and other ways. So we're going to see what happens. I think going forward, we'll see what the videos are like and we'll see what happens. I think sometimes they'll be longer, sometimes they'll be shorter. I'm going to do my best to give you points I think are important for you and useful for you. And we'll go from there. All right. So with that in mind, Richard Nixon, Tricky Dicky, Richard Milhous Nixon, President of the United States of America, resigned before being removed from office after the Watergate scandal. The thing about Nixon is he is an interesting president in many, many ways. He would have been controversial even without Watergate, and even if he hadn't had so much of those kind of perhaps morally dubious or questionable tactics and everything else. But he was an interesting figure, though. Going back throughout his career, Richard Nixon had always been a hardcore anti-communist, a hardcore kind of member of the right. Not crazy right or anything like that, in the sense there's crazy right or crazy left at this point, which there was. But the sense that, you know, he was hard against the communists, he was a tough leader. He wins in '68, and it shows how much the tenor of the conversation is changing, that he really focuses very hard on the idea of peace with honor. And this becomes a phrase closely associated with Richard Nixon over the following years. What's going on here? Well, ultimately, I'm not really all that sure that peace with honor was all that different from what Lyndon Baines Johnson was trying to do. Nixon effectively argued to the American people, we've got to get out of this war, but we've got to get out of it in a way that doesn't make us look bad. One, because that's not who we are. We're winners, we're not losers. But of course, secondly as well, the Cold War is going on. It's very important to Nixon that the Soviet Union respects the United States of America, and Nixon's not the only one. Many, many millions of Americans agree with him. Many millions of people across the Western world agree with him. Nixon is clearly contextualizing Vietnam within the Cold War, and that's kind of an interesting aspect of American policy in Vietnam this entire time. Lyndon Baines Johnson kind of didn't want to deal with Vietnam because he preferred to deal with domestic policies, but effectively felt he had to stay put because of domino theory. Nixon has more or less moved beyond domino theory, but is still definitely an adherent of containment. He's aided in this by his close advisor, Henry Kissinger. Henry Kissinger was this very prominent intellectual and political figure at the time, and really to this day, he's still with us. He's very gravelly voiced, German-born American kind of intellectual who was all about realpolitik and the reality of political interests, and the genius of Kissinger, and Nixon follows him in this, is reaching out to the Soviets and the Chinese, which had been, you know, supposedly unthinkable for years before that. Now, their success in that is kind of limited. They're also, maybe you could say they're ruthless. One of the big things that Nixon okays is bombing of Cambodia and even sending ground troops into Cambodia, which is not something the United States typically had any right to actually do, but they kind of did anyway. This is why Kissinger is accused by some of being a war criminal right up until this day. That and other things he's authorized or allowed and everything else. The whole thing was kind of tricky. Nixon had allegedly sent representatives out to the Vietnamese before the '68 election to effectively get them to hold off on bringing in a big ceasefire to help him electorally. This may or may not have happened. It probably happened. And Nixon went on, and you can see it from the readings for today in the primary sources, that Kissinger's being very frank with people in South Vietnam and people in communist China. He's being very frank about where the US is and what the US wants. So what's going on in all this? Nixon ultimately is navigating the reality of massive growing unpopularity of the war back in the United States, but there's still a huge chunk of Americans who effectively support the war, or at the very least are very much won over by Nixon's argument that, hey, the war is kind of lost, but we can't abandon the Vietnamese and we can't just let the Soviets win. We've got to find a way to kind of extract ourselves without being humiliated. And again, although there are important shifts here from what LBJ was doing, for example, Nixon was trying to make the South Vietnamese army, be able to stand up on its own, and it actually, by the end of the war, is the 4th largest army in the world. There's all these efforts the US are continuing to do to kind of, what LBJ called Vietnamize these South Vietnamese forces. So there's important Nixonian shifts in what's happening, but I think there's consistency as well. And Nixon is constantly navigating this problem. The media hates him. And young American, not every young American, but certainly the counterculture Americans hate him, right? Neil Young, the famous folk singer, has this great song, you know, even with the chorus, even Richard Nixon has got soul, right? There's this massive kind of popular culture idea that Nixon is almost the Antichrist type figure. But there's lots and lots of Americans, older Americans, not just older Americans, who like Nixon or respect Nixon or just respect the office of the presidency, whatever way you want to look at it. And this largely informs Nixon's famous silent majority speech.
1, 2, 3, 4, 36,
The fate of Lyndon Johnson did haunt Richard Nixon. He felt he had to demonstrate that most Americans still supported him and that it would not benefit Hanoi to stall peace negotiations. Don't get rattled. Don't waver. Don't react, he told himself as he went to work on a speech to respond to the protests. Insisting on writing it himself, he distinguished his supporters, the forgotten Americans, from the vocal minority in the streets with a new catchphrase.
To you, the great silent majority of my fellow Americans, I ask for your support. For the more divided we are at home, the less likely the enemy is to negotiate at Paris. Let us be united for peace. Let us also be united against defeat. Because let us understand, North Vietnam cannot defeat or humiliate the United States. Only Americans can do that.
It was the most effective speech of Nixon's presidency. 80,000 telegrams and letters arrived at the White House. Nearly all supported him. His approval rating soared. But the war continued, and with it the protests.
Peace with Honor proceeds through the early 1970s, so that by 1973 there's little over 20,000 American ground troops left in Vietnam, and then an agreement is struck that sees America remove its ground forces altogether. The idea here was that South Vietnam could hopefully hold its own, or perhaps if one is being, I don't know if cynical is the right word, skeptical, let's say, certainly as Dr. Lawrence, the editor of our sources today, is, that perhaps Nixon just wanted South Vietnam to hold out long enough in order for the US to not look bad. But that was basically impossible. That was basically impossible. And as we'll discuss on Friday, this fall of Saigon in 1975 is this massive kind of huge moment, not just in Vietnamese history, but in American history as well. And this idea of kind of this huge problem of the loss of confidence. So the discussion question for today is, how do we differentiate LBJ and Nixon? Or how could their approaches be seen as similar? Nixon is different. Nixon does change things. But how does he change things? Okay, thanks for watching.